Welcome to 15 Minutes of Risk, which in this video, ironically, is longer than 15 minutes. In this web series, I'm going to be looking at pieces of research from the perspective of people like me, clinicians. I'm a clinician and I read research with the intent of integrating the result of that research into my practice somehow. But as part of that practice, I have to assess validity. And that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be assessing validity around questions of internal validity, external validity, precision, and others, with the intent of using the result of that analysis to inform how I use that research in my own practice. And maybe you'll find it useful for your practice as well. Let's do a risk of bias assessment. And today we're going to take a look at a systematic review, a paper that was brought into me by a client of mine who happens to be a librarian. So they have an interest in both running and in research, and they were kind enough to bring in this lovely paper for me to read, which I did, and I liked it enough that I thought it might be nice for us to do an assessment of risk of bias on this paper together. So we're going to choose a risk of bias assessment tool called the AMSTAR tool. That's a tool that's appropriate to systematic reviews. So if you're doing a randomized control trial or another research design, the AMSTAR would not be an appropriate risk of bias assessment tool for you, but it's great for systematic reviews, was developed for systematic reviews, and that's what we have with our paper in question today. The paper in question, written by Klein and Patterson, published in 2023 in the journal called Sports Biomechanics. Name of the paper is Changes in Running Biomechanics in Masters Runners Over the Age of 50, a systematic review. And the paper, at a high level, just to give you some sense, it's looking at changes in biomechanics in Masters runners compared with younger runners. So the AMSTAR, and by the way, I'll put a link in the description where you can have a look at, I'll put the citation for a paper that describes the development of the AMSTAR, so you can have a look at that for yourself. The AMSTAR asks us to answer 16 questions about, internal structural bits and pieces of a systematic review, and gives us, in answering those questions, some sense of the internal validity of the paper. So let's take a look at this first question, which is, did the research questions and inclusion criteria for the review include components of the PICO? PICO is an acronym standing for Population, Intervention, Comparison, and Outcome. And so this question is asking us, in their research question for this paper, did Klein and Patterson clearly identify each element of that acronym? And I've answered yes to this question, although I will say that the paper substitutes intervention with exposure because it's a review of observational cohort studies. And the exposure is age, so it's not like you can apply an intervention age, it's just something that happens. So they defined their intervention as exposure to age instead of intervention, which I thought was acceptable. The population was runners over the age of 50. That's how they define Masters runners. And the comparison group, the C in our PICO, was runners under the age of 40. The intervention, as I mentioned, was actually the exposure to age. So I guess at least a 20-year spread, or at least a 10-year spread, I should say. Runners at least younger than 40 and at least older than 50. And the outcome was a little interesting. This was the part that was a little funky for me. They used this nebulous term biomechanics. They didn't pick a specific dimension of biomechanics like, vertical ground reaction forces or, hip extension. They just said biomechanics. So if I had to critique their research question in any way, it's that the outcomes were a bit loosely defined, but I still said yes to this question that they identified all elements of the PICO question. One other consideration about PICO questions is this T element that many authors include, T standing for time, and that time is typically intended to refer to the period between administering the intervention and measuring the outcome measure at follow-up. But Klein and Patterson defined their T differently. They used T to refer to a restriction of publication years for studies that they included in their literature search. That's not the typical use of the T in the PICO framework that I'm familiar with. It was enough for me to notice. It wasn't enough for me to change my answer to no on this AMSTAR question, but something of note. Okay, question 2 of the AMSTAR tool asks us, did the report of the review contain an explicit statement that the review methods were established prior to the conduct of the review, and did the report justify any significant deviations from the protocol? So what they're asking here is, was there a registry entry or a protocol published for this study? And indeed, there was a registry entry that the authors here, Klein and Patterson, did register this paper in before they actually did any of the work. And the registry was Prospero, which is a registry for for systematic reviews. And I've got the entry right here. And here you can see, their Prospero entry where they detail the bits and pieces of what they're planning on doing before they actually go ahead and conduct the study. And so they're asking for, on the AMSTAR tool, they're asking if we want to answer partial yes to this question, we need to see that they had elements in the protocol registry for review questions, for the search strategy that they were going to conduct. They needed to, in advance, identify inclusion-exclusion criteria and how they were going to assess risk of bias for the individual studies that were included in their review. And indeed, in our Prospero entry, we see all of these elements are included. This full yes on the AMSTAR asks questions about meta-analyses, and they didn't do a meta-analysis in this systematic review, so that part doesn't apply. So we answer partial yes to this question. Question 3 on the AMSTAR asks us, did the review authors explain their selection of the study designs for inclusion in the review? And indeed, in the Prospero registry, they do identify what types of study are going to be included under the title right here. Types of study to be included, which included cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, cohort studies. And they also included a statement that exceptions will be made to include interventional studies, meaning randomized control trials, if data included on the differences between older and younger runners. But they didn't include any randomized control trials in this systematic review, so apparently no such studies were found. So in any case, I can answer yes, because there's an explanation for including both randomized control trials and non-randomized investigations as well. So we answer yes to this question. Question 4 of the AMSTAR tool asks us, did the review authors use a comprehensive literature search strategy? And then they give us these criteria for answering either partially yes or yes. And the paper does give a pretty comprehensive discussion of the search strategy. And we can see that we have all the criteria for partial yes ticked. They searched more than one database, at least 2. They provided their keyword search strategy, and they justified the restrictions that they put on their search strategy as well. So we can definitely answer partially yes. For answering full yes, they only met one of the criteria listed here, and that's that they conducted the search within 24 months of completion of the review. But none of these other criteria were met. So we'll answer partial yes. Questions 5 and 6 on the AMSTAR tool ask us a couple of questions about how the authors duplicated their selection of studies to review from the results of the search strategy that they used, and how they extracted data. So question 5 asks us, did the review authors perform study selection in duplicate? And in the paper, it does describe how the 2 authors independently screened the literature following Prisma process, you can see here in figure 1, and then they convened to compare and filter results. So we can say yes to this question. At least 2 reviewers independently agreed on selection of eligible studies and so on. Question 6, did the review authors perform data extraction in duplicate? And again, here in the Prospero registry, actually, it says that full text articles will be reviewed and independently assessed by the 2 authors. The authors will again meet and discuss any disagreements, and if an agreement is not reached on any article, then an independent author will be brought in to arbitrate. So we can answer again yes to this question. At least 2 authors achieved consensus on which data to extract from the included studies. Question 7 of our AMSTAR tool asks us, did the authors provide a list of excluded studies and justify their exclusion? So what studies didn't they read in detail and include in their systematic review, and why not? And yes, we can see here on page 5 on this table, they've got this nice little list of articles that they didn't include in the review, and with some reasons there for exclusion. Question 8 of the AMSTAR tool asks us, did the review authors describe the included studies in adequate detail? So for the ones that they did actually review, what do we know about those studies? And they give us some, again, criteria for answering partially yes or fully yes. And we can see here, I can't even give a partial yes. They described many of these elements: population, intervention, comparison, outcome, but there was no description of any detail on the research design we can see in the chart here. So on this one, I have to say not even partial yes, so no. Question 9 on the AMSTAR tool asks us to assess if the authors used a technique or a tool for assessing the risk of bias in the individual studies that were included in the review. And it asks us to decide whether that assessment of risk of bias was satisfactory or not. And it gives us some criteria on which we can assess that level of satisfaction. And this is a bit of a beefy one to answer for this Klein and Patterson study. They did indeed use a risk of bias assessment tool, the NIH assessment tool for observational cohort and cross-sectional studies, or as I call it, the CADOX. But they did modify the tool. They took out a couple of items, examining for multiple assessments of the outcomes and for repeated measurement of the outcomes, which I think is an important component of assessing internal validity of a study. It's unclear to me why they decided to take out these items. I mean, they said that that these questions lacked applicability to the specified type of research. Now, having said that, it seems to me that the biomechanical outcomes that they're looking at could be measured in multiple ways and in a repeated fashion, even in a cohort study. So I don't know. I think that it would have been a useful and an important element to keep in the risk of bias assessment tool, but they felt otherwise. Nevertheless, they did report that all subjects in all studies were only assessed once for the outcomes in question. So I think that they did indeed consider that question. So again, it's not clear to me why they took these elements out of their risk of bias assessment tool, the CADOX. Anyway, their modified CADOX did include items that assessed for subject recruitment, that it was uniform, and from similar populations for the various study arms. It also included an item to assess that key confounders were identified and adjusted for. And then the CADOX, even their modified CADOX, also assessed validity and reliability of the outcome measures. So I answered yes to this question, but just with the considerations that I've just discussed. Question 10 of the AMSTAR, pretty straightforward, asking us, did the review authors report on sources of funding for the individual studies included in the review? And in this case, the authors did not. They did not. There was no note on funding of the individual studies that was reported in their paper, so I just answer no to this question. Questions 11 and 12 on the AMSTAR, easy for us in our review of Klein and Patterson. They do not apply. These are questions that ask about the conduct of meta-analyses, and this review did not include a meta-analysis, so these questions do not apply. So we answer not applicable. Question 13 of the AMSTAR tool is another interesting one. It asks us if the review authors account for the risk of bias in individual studies when interpreting and discussing the results of the review. And there's really no formal discussion of the impact of risk of bias assessment, that CADOX tool that they used, on the results of this study. They did, however, include a limitations section in their paper, and that discussed how one section of the CADOX, justification of sample size, was a source of risk of bias because many studies failed to attempt a power calculation and then went on to make what they described as questionable statistical inferences with their results. But the authors also state that this is apparently, anyway, a well-known, and this is quoting, a well-known issue in biomechanics literature. I'm not an expert in the biomechanics literature, so I'll just say it's apparently a well-known issue. Maybe it's difficult to get large sample sizes in biomechanics literature. I'm not sure. If you have any thoughts on that, definitely leave a comment on this video. They also identify risk of bias associated, the authors here, Klein and Patterson, identify risk of bias associated with inconsistent definition of the master's age range, which could muddle results if younger runners were defined as master's level in some studies versus older runners in others. So because there was no formal discussion of that risk of bias assessment, the CADOX assessment that they did, I said no, even though it's a big gray. There was some discussion of risk of bias as I just described. And now we have just a few easy questions to finish out our AMSTAR assessment. Question 14 asks us if the authors provided a satisfactory explanation for and discussion of any heterogeneity observed in the results of the review. There was no discussion of sources of heterogeneity, but I honestly feel like that might be a question better suited to studies or review studies where they conducted a meta-analysis. But still, I said no. Question 15 surrounded again is a question about meta-analysis conduct, and this does not apply, so I just said no meta-analysis conducted, so not applicable. And question 16, did the authors report any potential sources of conflict of interest, including any funding they received for conducting the review? And they did. Here on page 26, the authors report no competing interests. So there we have it. So once we've completed our risk of bias assessment, in this case using the AMSTAR tool, we have to decide what are we going to do with all this information. With the AMSTAR and with most of these risk of bias assessment tools, it's not like there's some score above which we decide that the internal validity of the paper we're assessing is good and below which we decide that it's bad. We just understand where the risks of bias are in the study and make a decision as to whether we think that that study is useful for us and our purpose. Now, I'm a clinician, and I'm doing this assessment as a clinician. Probably the audience is also going to be clinicians, and I like this study. Given what we've seen here, I think this is actually a really well done study. We've identified, a handful of what I would consider to be minor flaws in the conduct of this study, and the AMSTAR tool has helped us to assess those flaws. But it's not enough for me to say that this is not a useful study for me to apply to my own practice. There's some nice findings here, specifically that one of the key things older runners experience is a loss of plantar flexion power. So maybe that's something I can work on with my older runners in clinic. I think this is one of the better systematic reviews I've seen done. I don't conduct systematic reviews, but I do know how difficult it is to do good quality research. It's hard. It's not easy. You might think that it's simple to just check off a couple of things and include those, simple, easy to follow instructions on your sort of cookbook study design, but it's not. It's actually very difficult and extremely labor intensive to pull all these elements off. So I think that Klein and Patterson have done a good job. And I would use the results of their study to inform my practice. Maybe you have a different opinion. Leave a comment if you like.